I remember anxiously waiting in the dimly lit delivery room for the birth of my daughter. We got to the hospital that morning at 6 a.m. and it was approaching 7 p.m. that night. We had already been at the hospital for over 13 hours that day. When suddenly the nurses rushed in, took my wife away, and handed me a pair of scrubs, telling me to get ready for an emergency C-section. There were concerns about my daughter's heart rate each time my wife had a contraction. So we proceeded to surgery. About an hour later, the pediatrician on call informed me of an irregular sound she heard in my daughter's chest. A murmur, she called it, or what we would later find out to be a ventricular septal defect. Today, I would like to raise awareness and provide you with information about ventricular septal defects, or VSD for short. For those of you who don't know what a VSD is, you will learn about the condition, the implications it can have on one's health, and more general information as well. For those of you who may already know what a VSD is, you will still learn something as we cover recent studies and advances in medicine on the topic. My daughter Novalee was born with a VSD. She was diagnosed with it at birth and she's been living with it her entire life. Over the last 10 years, I have also spoken with many specialists in the field of pediatric cardiology. Today, I would like to talk to you about three things: what a VSD is, how VSDs are diagnosed, and how VSDs are treated. So what is a VSD? The American Heart Association's website, www.heart.org, last accessed July 20th, 2017, describes a VSD as a hole in the wall separating the lower two chambers of the heart. It's also the most common congenital heart defect. So common, in fact, that the Atlanta CDC estimates that 0.42% of children born are born with VSDs. That means with 353,000 children being born each day, Novalee was one of 1,412 children born that day with a VSD. Here we have an image of a heart with a VSD. Now typically blood flows into the right ventricle from the body, and then it flows up into the lungs where the blood becomes oxygenated. The oxygenated blood then travels back down into the left ventricle where it is then pumped out under higher pressure to the rest of the body. It's important to note that the left ventricle is under high pressure. So when that hole is there, when blood shooting through back into the right ventricle, that can cause that right chamber to enlarge. That's what they call an enlarged heart. Or the excess blood can flow back into the lungs where it oversaturates the lungs with blood. This is what they can call congestive heart failure if this continues for too long. The last thing we need to be aware of is cyanosis. A cyanosis is when unoxygenated or poor blood flow gets to the extremities of the body. This can cause a bluish tinged look on fingernails, toenails, lips, and gums. So now that we know what a VSD is and some of its implications, let's talk about how VSDs are diagnosed. So typically, whenever someone needs to have their VSD looked at, or they need to take a closer look at someone's heart, they use what's called an echo, or an echocardiogram. Echo is for short. So, the echocardiogram, they take an ultrasound image. MayoClinic.org, last accessed 7/20/2017, describes an echo as using sound waves to take a video image of a heart, which is then displayed. Here we have an image of a child having an echo done. You can see the ultrasound wand being moved across the chest, and they can take an image. The image is what you see here on the right. They can see the different chambers of the heart, measure blood flow flowing in and out of each chamber, and they can also measure the size of the defects. It's important to measure the size of the defects because that's how ventricular septal defects are classified. There are typically three classifications: small, medium, and large. A small is 0 to 3 millimeters in length. A medium is 3 to 6 millimeters in length, and a large is 6 millimeters in length or larger. So now that we know what VSDs are and how they're diagnosed, let's talk about treatment options. Typically, there are three different types of treatment options. We talk about monitoring, which is simple checkups, going back to the doctor and having repeated echoes and weight and height measurements taken so they can see on the growth chart to compare. Another thing that we want to look at is diet and medication. Luisa Forcelli, in her study, Children with Congenital Heart Disease, a Nutritional Challenge, published in October 1994, states that children with congenital heart defects may need additional calorie intakes because their heart is working that much harder. They're just breathing and eating and living they burn more calories than us. So in order for them to continue to grow properly, they need to have additional calorie intakes. We used to mix additional formula in with Novolee's bottles just to kind of thicken it up and give her those extra calories. The other treatment options are medications. There are typically 3 different types of medications. We have anticoagulants, which prevent blood clots from forming in the heart. Then we also have diuretics. Diuretics are important because they can, remove excess fluid from the lungs. So if we start to get a lot of excess fluid in the lungs, it'll pull that excess fluid away and allow the child to not have to work as hard. The last thing that we can use are called beta blockers, and that'll reduce blood pressure. This is important if we start to see an enlargement of the heart in that right ventricle, because we want to reduce those pressures and prevent that from happening. And the last option is surgeries. Now, sometimes the defect is just so large that you have to have surgery intervention. There are typically 2 different types of surgeries currently employed. One is called intracardiac, which is open heart surgery, where they actually go in and open up the chest cavity, spread the breastbone, and then go in and surgically place a synthetic patch over the hole. That is one way that they're doing it. Recently, they've also started experimenting with what's called a transcatheter style surgery, where they can make a small incision and go in with a catheter and place that synthetic patch there. That's not able to be used in all instances because some VSDs, the location of the defect weighs in on that, so they can't. So in conclusion today, I'd like to say that we've talked about 3 different topics. We've just talked about what a VSD is, how VSDs are diagnosed, and how VSDs are treated. Early on, it was a difficult time with Novolee. We had lots and lots of doctor visits, and we had to see pediatricians on a weekly basis in the beginning. It was very scary, and we didn't know the results of what the outcome was going to be. But with treatment and care, Novolee is now able to live a full life, and she's able to participate in physical activities to the extent of her own desire. And she's a happy and healthy child, even living with the defect to this day. It's important to know that with awareness and treatment, a defect doesn't define you. Hearts with holes can still have happy endings.